Thank you for watching and listening to the Wine Centric Show. Today, I am honored to welcome a titaness of this industry. On the Wine Centric Show, we speak to the titans and titanesses of this industry, but make everything simple, digestible, waffable for everybody, no matter where on your wine journey you are at. So, in celebration of Women's History Month, we have an all-female lineup for March. And to kick it off, this woman is a master sommelier. She is an author. She is prolific on 2 continents, written 2 books, major wine programs. The exploits go on and on and on. And here she is, Miss Jane Lopes. Welcome.
Thank you. I realized I hadn't told you how to pronounce my last name, so I'm very well done. You got it.
That is such a bone to pick with me, is when people don't pronounce names right. And I heard you recently on a podcast, I won't call them out, but they constantly said Lopez. And I'm like, I don't get it. But
Yeah,
yes.
I get it. Appreciate you doing the research. I don't know if you want to get into this, but I'm technically a suspended master sommelier. So
Okay.
I'm sure you heard about the whole thing, the cheating scandal in 2018.
Yes. As a matter of fact, Max Cast, who I'm sure you know, who's a master, but he was somehow involved in that. But please go ahead. I only bring him up because he's a friend of the show and lives in North Carolina as well.
Yeah. I like Max, and I think I call us friends. Like, we haven't hung out a ton, but we've spent some time together, and he's a really good guy. He was in my same class, but he went back and retested and I didn't. So because of that, I'm not really involved in the court.
Okay.
But my husband passed the year before me, and he's not super involved in it either. I think we've kind of found some other avenues.
Just remind me, and for our listeners,
one of the proctors and a member of the board at the time had emailed a few people, 3 or 4, we think, the identities of 2 of the wines on the exam.
So which means that everybody was disqualified or suspended is the term you're using.
That's the term that they used. And they basically said, you're suspended until you reset, which should have taken place after 3 years. But then they made a decision that for those of us who were impacted by this, we would never reset. So I could go back in 20 years and take just tasting again.
So you would just have to pass. So for those listening, you have to base tasting, theory, and service. But theory, service, then tasting, I think is the way it goes. Is that right?
Theory and then service and tasting are at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah. Typically, I think I took my service one day and then tasting the next, but I don't know if it has to be that way.
And so for you to be unsuspended or reinstated, you would have to go back and pass tasting again, but you could take it at any time, is what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. But I probably won't ever do that.
Is that because time, the association with the court now? Why?
I definitely was unhappy with how they handled it and felt like there should have been an investigation rather than just immediately sort of suspending everybody. It really has wreaked havoc on a lot of people's lives. I know people who've now gone back 3, 4 times to take tasting again, who were master sommeliers and still can't get it back. And I think it's just put all of us in an unfair position. But I think more than anything, this is obviously a really hard test, right? I spent so much time preparing for it. And for myself personally, I feel like I need to be all in if I'm going to do it. And I'm not all in, I just I don't know what my reasons would be for going back. And I feel like without sort of a why, it's hard for me to put in the time to kind of get back to that place. So that's kind of it with me. And I feel like I've found some really good avenues to stay connected to education and advocacy in the industry that have resonated with me even more. I'm on the board of this organization called the Vanguard, which is Bay Area, California based, and just a really wonderful organization that's toward equity and better environmental practices for the wine industry. So that, and still do blind tasting seminars. And I I definitely would never tell anyone not to go through those exams. I think the information's out there that people kind of know some of the risks involved with going down that path. And I don't think, I at least do believe that because of the New York Times article, there's less sexual misconduct. I think that showed everyone that there's consequences for that. And so I don't hear about that as much, which is obviously an unequivocal positive. And the organization has made strides to be better in terms of more transparency, more feedback, more kind of rigorous standards on their end for, I guess, the protection of the exam. And I know they did like some bias training and stuff like that. I don't regret any time I devoted towards preparing for those exams and being in that community. I really don't. And I feel like I got a lot out of it. But I think, that's not everyone's story.
What would you tell somebody who's trying to break in as a sommelier and really get educated, and what route would you tell them to go at this point?
That's a great question. And I don't really know. And I think it really depends so much on people's location, what is even offered, where they live, where they work, people's personality types, I think plays into it in terms of what sort of works for them. So many more people now than when I was coming up are doing WSET, going through the rungs there. And it feels like that has been a real positive for a lot of people in the industry. But I do think there's, especially for people in service jobs, there's something that's really satisfying and helpful about doing these, service-based exams. And there are a lot of like great online, more digitally based groups. There's a woman in Ohio who has like a really great digital tasting group that she sends out samples every month. And so I think there's a lot, I guess there's more diversity of ways to get involved, to improve your skills and education, that I think people hopefully now more than ever are just doing a little bit more research and figuring out, the track that works best for them.
Yeah, I'll say because a lot of the reset people that I've talked to, there's such a diversity. Some are genuinely well trained and educated, and then there's some it's like, you studied Weiss? Like, I don't get it. But what I'm gleaning from what you're saying is you really have to kind of do your own research and see it's a very individual thing. But I think also the good thing is now there are a lot more options. I know that when you were studying, you referenced Guild Somm a lot, which also had its own internal strife. But as far as the content they put out, you also have more resources like Wine Folly. You have people writing books like yourself, and then you have the Jancis Robinsons of the world and all that stuff. So I guess you kind of got to piece it together from a hodgepodge of different things, but reading, tasting, and reaching out to people like yourselves. Reach out to me. It's Matt at Wine Centric Show, and I can certainly direct you to the right people. Thank you for sharing that.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. Turns out, the irresistible magic of sparkling wine just won't let me go. And this time, I'm here to prove that bubbles and barbecue are a match made in heaven. I've teamed up with 10 of my favorite chefs and pitmasters to bring you an unforgettable tasting experience. BBQ and bubbly. We're taking over Fenton in Cary, North Carolina. It is the premier food and dining destination, and it takes place on May 31st from 1 to 4 p.m. VIPs get in an hour early at 12 p.m.
A portion of the proceeds will be donated to Cure Search for Children's Cancer.
Thanks to our friends, the Raleigh Wine Shop and Luella Durham, you'll get to sip on 20 incredible sparkling wines, champagne, Prosecco, Pet Nats, and beer by Bond Brothers, paired perfectly with some of the best barbecue you've ever had. Tickets are on sale now. Check out bit.ly/BBQ Bubbly. That's bit.ly/BBQ BUBBLY. See you there.
I want to jump with a little brain exercise teaser, and this is going to be simple for you. What I want to do, if you're game, because You import Australian wines. You are one of the foremost authority in this country for Australian wine. And one of, I think, your big platforms is the fact that Australia has so much to offer, so much diversity, so much variety. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to call out famous wine regions in the world, right?
Okay.
Like we'll role play as if you were at Attica, let's say you're the restaurant where you were the wine director. And I'm going to say, oh, I really like to drink wine from X region. Here's why. And then I'd like you to tell me where in Australia I could find that, or even a particular bottle of wine could be from your portfolio. Does that work?
Cool. Yeah, that's great. Let's do it.
I really love Chablis. I love Premier Cru Chablis. I love the zippiness. I love everything about it, the rich texture. What should I drink from Australia?
I would probably take you to Tasmanian Chardonnay. Tasmania is overall the coolest climate growing region in Australia, and especially in the north, but in the south as well, you get Chardonnays that have that sort of precision, the length, but also a little bit of that kind of creamy, lazy texture to them. But yeah, I think that's where I would land, is Tasmania for Chablis.
I'm in. You have a particular
The number one that comes to mind is not in the US, a guy named Joe Holyman, but we work with Sailor Seek's Horse in the South, which has a little bit less of that lees quality, if that's something you're really after from Chardonnay. But in terms of like precision and length and purity, like they have that in spades. So yeah, Joe Holyman and Sailor Seek's Horse, I think, would be good.
Sailor Seek's Horse is the name of it?
Correct.
What a great name for a Tasmanian wine.
Yes, and it comes from a real life modern posting on like a bulletin board at a coffee shop that literally was a sailor who was seeking a horse.
I love it. And it makes so much sense for Tasmania, obviously being like,
Kind of.
yeah, being somewhat coastal.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's even get more specific. I like an homage back to former guests. I really love Maurice Saint-Denis. I love the finesse, the beautiful, pretty style of Pinot Noir.
Yeah, I would go to Gippsland. So a big region geographically. It's actually a zone, not a region, but it sort of is sort of the entire coast of east of Melbourne, in the very southeastern corner of Australia. But it's very sparsely planted, only about 140 hectares under vine, and part of that is because it's just a difficult place to farm. It's wet, it's cold, much like Burgundy. And so you don't have sort of a ton of producers there, but there's a guy named Bill Downey who actually, worked in Burgundy for a long time, worked Fourier and Berlinier, and just makes like really elegant, precise, aromatic Pinot Noirs that are, just absolutely gorgeous.
Gippsland. Okay.
Gippsland.
And so what province or what state would that be in?
Victoria.
Victoria. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is awesome. Let's do one more. I like Brunello di Montalcino. I like the power of Sangiovese, the grippiness, the bright cherry. Where would I go?
So there's a region in northeastern Victoria called Beechworth. And I think as far as Sangiovese and even Nebbiolo goes, this is one of the best places in Australia. And it is sort of like this isolated hill that kind of like sits on top of a few different valleys. So it has, that in common with Montalcino. And there are a few producers doing really, really excellent Sangiovese. Fighting Gully Road is a producer we work with. There's a producer called Castagna, who their kind of signature is a blend of Syrah and Sangiovese. That's like totally delicious.
Yeah.
A few great Nebbiolo producers too, like Gioconda, who's very famous for their Chardonnay, also makes a really delicious Nebbiolo. It seems sort of like niche that people are picking up these Italian grapes, but there's actually a lot of terroirs in Australia that really make sense for them. There's no reason that grapes like Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet should be transplanted all over the world, but Sangiovese, Nebbiolo, and Near d'Avola shouldn't. So it's actually been one of the most exciting parts of Australia for us is discovering sort of those like quote unquote alternative grapes that are growing really, really well.
That sounds awesome. Yeah. And it makes sense. I mean, I don't know if it was arbitrarily, but like, why was Syrah/Shiraz planted in Australia to begin with, right?
Yeah, it was one of the many cuttings that came over, early on in Australia. And, I think it took to a lot of the climates, and especially sort of in, not the earliest of the early days, but sort of in the mid-range in Australia, like the late 1900s. It made really good fortified wine, and that was a
Mm.
really popular style of wine, both domestically and shipping back to the UK. So, but yeah, there's all these reasons that go beyond kind of pure climate specificity for why grapes work, and why grapes are popular, right? Why it's a lot easier to sell Cabernet Sauvignon than it is, Neradabla.
Yeah. But to your point, speaks to the diversity of Australia. I don't know if you know this, switching gears for a second, but I'm going to pat myself on the back here for a second. I knew you were going to be a star from the moment I met you. I don't know if you remember, but Jessica, she was Jessica Certo at the time. She's now
Yeah.
Jessica Norris, used to host a blind tasting group at Del Frisco's in New York City. And I was very new to the group. I don't remember if I had just passed certified or not, but like I hadn't done any blind tasting in a very long time. And somehow I got paired with you to taste. And you were just like, you knocked it out of the park. And I can only imagine that you were looking at me like, what the heck is this dude doing here? But I think I got like 2 out of 6. Like, so on the first try, I was,
Yeah, and I certainly was not knocking every flight out of the park. I think I was never like a really instinctual blind taster. Like for me, it was putting all the pieces together. You meet those people who just like put their nose in the glass and they're like, "Oh, that's 2018 Chablis or whatever," and that wasn't me. But
yeah,
I was good at sort of like figuring out how to piece together a wine. So I'm glad I
tactically.
had a good flight.
No, you were clearly on point. That was really good introduction to you. I want to take it back for a second because before all the accolades, the book writing, everything, I think you were an actress. Like you did plays in college.
In college. Yeah.
Any significant ones or like your favorite roles or playwrights?
There was this like really bizarre play called Ivona, Princess of Burgundia, which at the time I wasn't a wine person at all. I probably didn't even know that, Burgundy was a place, which was like, I think it was a Polish author. But it was like almost sort of a fairy tale. And I got to have like a really cool costume and I was the queen, and that was a lot of fun, and still good friends with a few people who were in that production. For me, my family's sort of a theater family.
Okay.
My sister's a theater director. Her husband's an actor and a dancer. And my mom was on the board of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival for a long time.
Wow.
So it was something I always really enjoyed. Likewise, to sort of wine, I really enjoyed the community that it sort of created. And it certainly was good for like practicing public speaking and stuff like that. I think you learn some important tools and skills, but I don't think it was ever quite going to be a career for me. So once I graduated college, I think I went on like a couple auditions and I was like, I don't think this is for me. It's
And that
just
would have been in Chicago.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The reason I asked that, and this is my impression, but I see you taking up the mantle, the accolades we've talked about, but and you've even said this previously when you were on Esquire TV about sommeliers in New York City studying for the Master Sommelier exam. I feel like in essence you're more comfortable with the pen in hand or at the typewriter, but you've sort of forced yourself amidst anxiety and all of the other self to be front facing to like take up that mantle. But is that accurate or am I
You
totally off
know,
base?
I think so. I guess the way I look at it, I think it actually did feel natural to me early in my life to be on stage. And not that like I wasn't nervous about it, but I think that like a certain level of nerves are healthy.
Totally.
Mm, I think it was more kind of a little bit later in life, like more post-college, that I developed some anxiety issues that made it a little bit more difficult to, in those sort of performative settings. And then I absolutely turned to writing. And now it's funny because I feel like my anxiety is better. I'm not like eager to go like double decant on television again, but like in general, like I feel like my anxiety is better than it used to be. But I do feel like I've become so accustomed to, writing after spending these sort of long periods of time on writing projects, that I do sometimes feel like I just like can't find the word I'm looking for orally, where it's like, it's much easier for me when I'm sitting in my computer. And if I can't find the word, I can Google it, I can get a thesaurus, I can think about it for a second. And so I do feel like now I've sort of turned to like not being quite as good at speaking, but still not terrible. So yeah, I think it's just been sort of a little bit of a up and down with that. And I really credit writing to being a very kind of helpful therapeutic experience in my life. And I don't kind of write on a daily basis. I mean, of course, like emails and stuff, but I kind of know it's always there when I need.
By the way, that's called word dysplasia, when you forget words, or it's just like, what does that mean? And
yeah,
unfortunately, that's at least at my age, that's a real thing. So it's just like constantly on the synonym search, right? To find
Yes.
other words to express what you want to say. So you were working in New York City. You worked at 11 Madison Park. Obviously, before that, you were in Nashville at the Catbird and worked at Lush in Chicago. I'm curious as to what was happening at the time that a New Zealand-born chef invites a New York-based American sommelier to come run his wine program in Australia.
So there was a warm introduction, I guess you could say. The GM at the time at Attica in Melbourne, we had worked together. He had been a manager at 11 Madison Park.
Okay.
An Irish guy named Kevin McSteen, but who had not lived and worked in Ireland for a very long time, worked in London at Dinner by Heston, and then helped open a restaurant called Vue de Monde in Melbourne, and then came to, I might be getting that chronology wrong, but then I came to New York and was manager at 11 Madison Park. And he actually met Ben Shorey, who's the Kiwi you're referring to, when the San Pellegrino 50 Best Awards were in New York in 2016. And they hit it off, and Ben had recently taken over ownership of the restaurant. He'd worked there since 2005, but it previously had been owned by someone else. So he'd recently taken over ownership, needed a new manager, and, Kevin loved Australia, wanted to get back there. So Kevin came into Melbourne and was the GM at Attica. And they also needed a wine director and sort of had someone who was a little bit more interim at the time. And so I had decided to give my notice at 11 Madison Park, just kind of felt a little burnout, wanted to work on my first book, wanted to study for the MS exam. And so I gave my notice at 11 Madison Park and literally was like chatting online with Kevin that night and told him I gave my notice. And he was like, cool, that's perfect. I really need a wine director. Yeah, and like at first, John and I, my now husband, then, boyfriend, we were like, that's crazy, we can't move to Australia. Then it was kind of like, why not? We don't have a mortgage, we don't have children, we probably didn't even have plants. Like, we had a cat. That was our biggest responsibility.
Was that a Bo? Yeah. Short for botrytis. Awesome.
Yeah. Who did end up coming with us to Australia. But
a long trip for a cat.
Well, and Australia has some pretty serious biosecurity laws. So that was definitely the hardest part of relocation, was getting that cat there and back.
They have to be quarantined for like a month or something like that, right?
It's only 10 days now, but it's because you have basically a 6-month quarantine period in the US before they can leave. So we actually had to leave before Bo. So we had to leave her with friends in New York who had to finish off her testing and stuff, because they don't have rabies in Australia. They're very careful not to introduce those diseases. And from like a viticulture perspective, they don't have Pierce's disease, and phylloxera is relatively confined to really just Victoria. Most states in Australia have never seen phylloxera. So like when we were just back there, as soon as we got pretty much everywhere, we were dipping our feet in bleach, our shoes, between all the stops to make sure that we weren't carrying anything with us from one vineyard to the next.
That was your choice, or that was the vineyard people, that was the wineries asking you to do so?
Both. We carried around with us a tub and bleach and stuff so we could, make sure we were on the up and up. But most wineries who were own rooted or just didn't have phylloxera in the vineyard, wanted to protect whatever rootstock they were on.
That's incredible. Just because you think about the origin story of Australia coming over from Europe, you would think, and all the trade, you would think at some point, phylloxera, we're talking about obviously the louse that gets into your vines and eventually eats them all and essentially kills them slowly. You would think at some point it would have been brought over.
And it was isolated, exactly. So it came over. Geelong was the first region it was in, and Victoria. So originally it hit sort of a handful of regions in Victoria, but was contained. And then Victoria, for the most part, except for a handful of regions, really had sort of a dormant period through most of the early 1900s. And that was due to a number of things. Part of it was the popularity of fortified wine, which was growing. Grapes were growing better for that in warmer climates. And there was an economic depression and all of those things. And so you kind of just had this period of where that allowed things to sort of settle. And so when people kind of started planting, let's say in the Yarra Valley in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, it couldn't feel like it was an issue. So people were planting on rootstock, and the Yarra Valley didn't see phylloxera until 2006. So it is sort of this, I feel like when you learn about the world of wine, phylloxera is sort of presented as this ancient history sort of thing.
Yeah.
When it's actually the containment of the spread and the mitigation and how people are thinking about it when they plant new vineyards, that's all very, very much current events in Australia.
But if you're planting new vineyards, it would seem to me that you would use phylloxera resistant rootstock, right?
Yeah, in some places definitely are, for multiple reasons, for also just, there is some benefit in selecting, you can select rootstock that's particularly drought resistant or heat resistant or whatever it is. But there are definitely people who are planting new vineyards who want them to be own rooted. But largely you're talking about sort of protecting old vines, vines that have been in the ground for a while now. And yeah, Australia has most of the oldest vines in the world. So there is a real biosecurity threat, and there's a real reason to take it seriously, trying to protect these vines.
I love the culture of cleanliness, both in Australia and New Zealand. And if you're gotten lost and you're listening, you're like, well, what's the big deal about rootstocks and stuff like that? Well, as we talk about wine as an agricultural product, the better grapes you grow, the better wine it's going to eventually make, the better the healthiness of the vine, and everything that goes into it ends up in the resulting wine. And so the longer a vine, the more age it has, the more complex the resulting wine gets, to simplify it in a way. Okay, so you get to Attica, one of the best restaurants in the world. You're building the wine program there. And by the way, so you got there in 2018, right?
2017.
2017. Okay. And then you moved back to the States in 2020?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. A 3-year stint of wildly immersive learning about not only Australian wine, but Australian culture. That's incredible. How did you do? You are, I don't know if you'd say this about yourself, but at least for the United States, you're probably the foremost authority, you and your husband, on Australian wine in this country, right?
We're certainly waving the flag as much as anybody. I think it's always that thing. We feel like we're generalists about Australia. We know a little bit about a lot, and certainly there are always going to be people who are wine growers and,
Sure,
Adelaide
but they're
Hills are
probably more
but they're not.
expert in their
Yeah.
region than
Yeah.
the country overall.
Yeah, exactly. We certainly have tried to educate ourselves as much as possible and try to keep up on everything. And the book we wrote was really,
Talking about how to drink Australian.
yeah. So we wrote that during the pandemic completely from the United States. So in a way, though, I think that was the book in a really positive direction, because it wasn't ever going to be a book about like, Jade and John go to this region and record their opinions. It was really a book about collecting knowledge from the most knowledgeable people, from the people who are on the ground, whether it's Australian wine writers or sommeliers, and more often than not, the winemakers and viticulturists, and really collecting their experience, their opinions, and digesting that. So yeah, in that process, we learned an absolute ton.
And is that because you said it was in the pandemic, so you're in lockdown and you're just emailing, calling, and that was the nice thing. One of the silver linings of the pandemic is everybody was available because they weren't doing anything. They weren't traveling.
Yeah. We had probably about 100 Zoom interviews that we did with various folks on the ground over in Australia. So yeah, it was just sort of collecting information, reading as much as we could, and then doing our own research, our own interviews to, just collect, what we didn't want the book to be, how you kind of sometimes read wine books and like, they're like, this region has these soils and grows these grapes and has
Yeah,
this
you're like
climate.
checking boxes about
Yeah.
this is that this is where you get that.
And you don't leave really feeling like the significance of one region to the next. There's that massive Wines of the Northern Rhone book, which is an incredible amount of detail. And I surely created a lot of flashcards from that book, but I felt like it was, the experience with importers and winemakers and with fellow sommeliers that really taught me about the differences between Cornas and Saint Joseph and Côte Rôtie and stuff like that. Not so much this like really densely packed book. And it was sort of like, we wanted people to be able to read this book and kind of feel like, okay, I have an idea of what, the lack of a better word, like the vibe of, Yarra Valley is, or Heathcote or Beechworth or whatever it is. And I understand what the current issues are and what people are excited about, what they're worried about, kind of giving personality and voice to all these regions, not just another sort of like dry sort of rote regurgitation on paper,
Yeah, what you write is not a textbook. It's more of a testimonial to the region and an insight for somebody to viscerally connect with it. And obviously that's your style. I think that's probably what you're known for, especially after writing Vignette, your first one, which takes you through all the regions of the world and masterfully weaves in your personal stories and personal connection with these wines and spirits. And for those of you that haven't read the book, I'll just tell you, a colleague of mine said to me, it's not only the best wine book I've read, it's the best book I've read. So that just gives you a little bit of insight of like people on any level can enjoy this book because you weave a very personal story into it. Have you always been open about like personal life before you wrote that book?
It's funny. I've always felt like I'm happy for people to know my story. And actually sometimes I would prefer for people to, know what I'm going through, know my story, but I don't want to have to tell them.
Yeah.
So
It's like, here's my resume, here's who I am. So you just know, let's get that out of the way.
Yeah. So a book was honestly sort of perfect because I could write it, have this sort of like almost, cathartic, therapeutic experience of writing. And I could get my story out into the world without like actually having to like have a conversation with people and tell them. And even like some people I've known for decades, like, wrote me and were like, oh, I had no idea you were going through that. And, because I don't, I don't kind of make it front and center of sort of my everyday, at least in my interactions with other people. So yeah, I mean, I guess no is the answer to your question. Like, I think I have been somewhat private previously, but yeah, not because I cared if people knew, but because I didn't necessarily want to or know how to tell people.
Yeah, it's almost easier to write about it in your own quiet setting.
Yeah. And I think it's a good reminder that a lot of, people are dealing with things we don't know all the time, every day. And just to always be kind. I don't know if there's a better lesson, but I think there are so many people, dealing with mental health issues, physical health issues, you know, family issues, like money issues, things that we don't know and we don't see.
It's what my wife and I tell our children, our two boys. We just say, I know it gets hard, but really it's simple. If you just think, be respectful and be kind. That's it.
Yeah.
It's really it.
Yeah.
You talk a lot in the book about your health and it's gone up and down. How is it now?
Not bad. I'd say in general, like fairly stable. Like we'll definitely go through some ups and downs, and I do still have a baseline of some anxiety, which, isn't necessarily a terrible thing. I try to remind myself that like it's just because I care, and because things do have stakes, whether it's a business interaction or a social interaction or whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, no, largely much better than for most of what I wrote about in Vignette. It's also just feels in many ways like a little bit more stable point in my life. Not that it's a particularly stable time in the wine industry right now.
Or the world.
But I guess sort of in my micro life, I guess you would say, like, John and I are very nice and settled here in Nashville. I think having a purpose, we feel like we're really introducing the United States to a country that is doing important work in the world of wine, both in terms of the quality of the diversity of the wine that's being produced, but also in terms of like ethical labor practices. And that's something we talk about a lot, and I think is an issue in our industry. And so we feel strongly about what we're doing over here, and I think that sort of keeps us going through the hard moments.
Yeah, it's fulfilling.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to leave Australia?
So from early on, we knew we were not going to stay in Australia sort of indefinitely. And part of that was a visa issue. Like the visa that we originally were sponsored on, which was a work visa through Attica, that sort of visa class was dissolved. And so we had to apply while we were already in Australia. We had to apply for another visa. And the immigration lawyer that Attica worked with basically told us that we would have a lot better chance of getting this visa if we wrote a statement saying we weren't going to apply for permanent residency or citizenship. And, and at the time we felt like, as much as we were excited to be in Australia and enjoying ourselves and enjoying learning and enjoying our jobs, we didn't feel like we wanted to be away from our family and friends for an indefinite period of time. So it felt like a pretty easy decision to make of like, okay, we're not going to stay here permanently. So yeah, basically my visa, we could have stayed maybe about another 6 months on my visa, I think, but I had made a commitment for 3 years to Attica. And so we kind of just felt like, okay, we'll do the 3 years. We're going to travel around Australia a little bit when that's over. And then we'll head back to the US. And we had already laid out the business plan for Legend, which is the imports company. So, and we kind of felt eager to do that and really like get back in the US and really show everybody what we'd learned and picked up and been exposed to in Australia. So yeah, we ended up coming back a little earlier because we were originally planning to come back early May of 2020. And so that, got bumped up a bit. But honestly, like in the scheme of COVID, it was good timing. We weren't planning to be working in that time anyway. We had saved up money. We were living with family. So, we missed out on about a couple months of travel, but, can't really complain too much about that.
You saved money. No, you were able to start a business.
It's true.
I want to get into Legends, and that's your portfolio that you're importing to the US and the business side of that. But before we get there, I asked people, hey, if I was to do an episode on Australia, who should I talk to? Everybody said you. And the female response, especially as we're honoring Women's History Month, was like, it was tangible, like the feeling of connection. And going back to the book, obviously you write about you're open about sexual exploits and stuff like that. What does it feel like when you connect with these, or I should say it this way. What are some of the funniest or most inspiring moments other young female sommeliers or wine professionals have said to you or interacted with you?
I can't think of any funny ones off the top of my head. I'm sure they exist. But it's true. I do, when I meet sort of a certain age bracket of young women in the industry, typically they've either seen the show or read a book or something. And I think it is meaningful to people to have someone who has been vulnerable and still found success. Because I definitely got pushback even from people I love and who love me, who were kind of like, oh, I don't know if you should share so much. You're going to be seen as weak, and don't agree with that. And I'm sure there are some people who have seen me as weak. I don't know, but I think that the more we can be honest and vulnerable about what's going on in our lives, is hard for us. I think that's strength. I think that that someone, and I mean, no one's employing me right now, but I would hope that someone would look at my accomplishments as well as my, hardships and say, this is someone I would want to hire because they have found success despite dealing with some shit.
Yeah. You came out on the other side.
Yeah. And so, I think for women who felt anxiety or depression or insecurity or been sexually harassed or any number of these things, which certainly are not unique to women, but certainly I think women experience at a higher rate in our industry. I feel like society tells you to be quiet about it, and you feel like you're in a silo and you kind of feel like you're alone in these things. And so I think for people to read about it and feel like I'm not alone, someone else has dealt with these things and they've been vocal about it. So, maybe I can be vocal about it too. And I think that was what happened that allowed that New York Times article to come together, is a lot of women just started talking to each other and being like, oh, I wasn't the only one, and this is a pattern, and this is a big deal, and this is a problem. And I know for me, it was easy to think of my own individual experience as like, one-off thing, and it's not a big deal, and it didn't disrupt my career, and blah, blah, blah. But I think when I saw sort of the pattern, and I saw how much damage had been done, it was much easier for me to say like, oh, okay, no, we have to say something about this. So yeah, no, I do meet lots of younger to not so younger anymore women in our industry who, feel a connection with me. And that's, obviously really meaningful. Like, I wrote a super personal book. So when people express that it's been meaningful to them, that's all I wanted. It was hard to get that book published because a lot of publishers thought it was weird. And I kind of got the feedback of like, either just make it a memoir or make it a wine book, like this hybrid thing. Like, what are you doing? It's too much. But I just thought, to me, like, that was the story. Like, it wasn't one without the other. It was how I'd sort of built this life through wine and through learning about wine and feeling connected to wine, and that my story had become intertwined with wine, with the wine industry, with my wine studies, and that was sort of the point I wanted to make.
There's so many things to unpack there.
I know. I feel like I just
No, I love it. It's great. First of all, that is such a previous generation thought about vulnerability being weakness, and I think today, even though I'm somewhere in like, I don't know, my like Generation X or something, I don't know. I don't pay attention to those, but the understanding that, yeah, vulnerability is human. And when you succeed despite your vulnerability and you're open about it, not only does it empower you, but it empowers others because it resonates with them. And they're like, okay, you have the same problems. So do I. And now I can go forward with that. So like man, female, whatever your gender is, like that's a lesson for everybody, I think. And we appreciate that because like the kids who grow up and they never had any trauma or drama or issues, and then they don't know how to deal with life because it's never been difficult for them. But it's when you learn to deal with issues and situations, that's when I think it builds a thicker skin, for lack of a better term. The other thing, some of the best wine books ever, like, and most popular, the Kermit Lynch, what is it, on the
Wine
road,
route.
on the wine,
Yeah.
on the wine route, is one of the most famous wine books ever written, probably one of the most successful. So like that weaving your personal story, I mean, I don't know who the publisher that said that wasn't a good idea, but it's hard to, it's funny. It's just like doing this show and being in the wine business. And like, you think about, oh my God, I'm trying to be a thought leader in this. And then you think like, at the end of the day, you're only dealing with such a specific set of people who care about wine as intimately as I do and you do and the people we talk to on the show. So it's like, it's an uphill battle, but it's amazing. And that's why your book is so great, because it really crosses over those from wine to everything. I have like two last questions and then we'll get out of here as we're getting at time. I have to think that in many ways, and maybe you can validate this, but I think that you inspired Will Guidara to write Unreasonable Hospitality.
I definitely don't think that's true.
Okay.
I love my time at 11 Madison Park. I have a good relationship with Will, who actually bought a house in Nashville. So he's
No
around.
way.
I think I'm not positive if he's moved here yet, or there's still elsewhere. The culture of 11 Madison Park was well in place when I arrived, and it just was a really good fit for me. I know I hadn't been like the best employee at some previous restaurants I worked at, and part of that was just like I wasn't fully fulfilled by the work I was doing. And I really was at 11 Madison Park, and it was incredibly exciting to be a part of such a talented team, to work with such like a massive cellar and wine list, and to participate in that style of service was so much fun. And like I was really anxious about it going in, but I kind of quickly realized that like there weren't this infinite ways that you could do wrong. That was sort of what I was concerned about, that there was this one way I could do that job correctly and a million ways I could mess it up.
Yeah.
And that would just like actually turned out to not be true. That felt like as long as I cared about creating a great experience for my guests, and caring meant preparing and being knowledgeable about the wine list and the pairings and the food and all of those things. And as long as I cared and I was present, I was kind of going to be fine. And it's always one before the other. So yeah, I absolutely loved working there. It was incredibly fun. We were allowed to we were encouraged to be ourselves, to have fun, to be present with our guests, to do these legends where we basically just like could create whatever we wanted in a dining experience. And I had a blast. It was really fun reading that book, because some of the origins of his story and of the 11 Madison Park story, I didn't fully know. It was really fun, and I'm grateful to have been a part of that team at the moment I was.
Yeah. Well, Unreasonable Hospitality is the book you're talking about, which is written by Will Guidara, who was instrumental in creating the Bear show, which everybody references for restaurant culture and stuff like that if you're out of the business. But I only bring that up because, well, you worked at 11 Madison Park, but I have to think in some way, and like Will's, although he's not like a competitive in that way, maybe this is my small brain, but just thinking like, well, if my employee wrote a book, I'm going to write a book, damn it. I can do it too.
Maybe. I don't think so, though. I think I think Will was probably on that track already. If anything, I would think maybe Danny Meyer's book was like the inspiration for that. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about setting the table. And then perfect segue, because I didn't even connect those two together. The stories in Unreasonable Hospitality about legend, like if you did something for a guest that was just exemplary, that would be referred to as a legend. And your wine import company is called Legend.
Which is really funny because honestly, we didn't put that together either.
Okay, good.
That was not the idea behind it.
Okay.
But it was funny. When we just started the company, we dined at Red Hook Tavern, and the GM there had been a sommelier at Madison Park, and she did like a legend for us. And we were like, duh. Like, it wasn't why we named the company Legend. It was because of how Legend used in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a very everyday, almost kind of term of endearment. If you hold the door open for someone, like something as small as that, it's like, thanks, Legend. You get someone a coffee, it's like, you're a legend. Remember when I used to put in orders with my distributors, it would be, not like a phenomenal order. It'd just be like, send me a case of this Sancerre and this Shiraz for Tuesday or whatever. And it's like, all right, Legend, that'll be with you Tuesday. And it was this very sweet thing.
Yeah.
A way of appreciating the people around you. And also certainly has the dual meaning of, we think our producers are legends in a more American sense of the word. And then, having the third meaning of sort of the EMP legend was something we hadn't thought about, but also fits nicely into our story.
Yeah, they all tie in together.
Yeah.
Was it a strategic part of the business plan that you would write books at the same time as opening this company? Because they intertwine so beautifully, and it's really smart from a business.
It certainly wasn't in the original business plan or anything like that, but it was truly immediately after we started the company. So our first container landed in October of 2020. And we were writing this book by January. So it was really immediately as soon as we started selling Australian wine, we were, I guess, putting ourselves into our shoes of like 20 something sommeliers and wine buyers. How would we really get those people engaged with Australian wine? Like, how is anyone going to create a great Australian wine program if there's not a way to learn about Australian wine? And I think one of the key things that we try to drive home is the regionality, because I think, we're talking about Chablis and Maurice Saint-Denis, and like, those are what make Burgundy as a brand powerful. Burgundy isn't powerful as a brand without having these like special, minute regions within it that we can learn about, and we can study the different vineyards and producers and soil types. And we just knew that like, we can't sell Australian wine. We have to sell Adelaide Hills and Tasmania and Gippsland and Heathcote and like these individual regions. That's how we get people invested and engaged with Australian wine. And it's how we do away with sort of, I guess, some of the bad connotations, the negative connotations of Australian wine, right? Like the yellowtail sort of connotations. And is by getting away from Australia as a whole, by talking about these individual regions. But yeah, there weren't much in the way of educational resources. Many of these regions had never been mapped in like a wine context. So it just felt like if we can give people something that they can use to really sink their teeth into Australian wine, that's gonna hopefully, change the game. So I think we had our contract by January 2021. Originally it was with the same publisher that had done my first book. We ended up switching publishers about halfway through, and that's another long story. But yeah, it was immediately after we started the business of saying, oh, okay, this is something that we need.
So brilliant. And what a great passion project, but also a smart business. Just real quick, how can we find these wines in wherever we're living?
We are distributed in 30 states.
Okay.
I'd say some of those are more active than others. But, just like you could go into a wine shop and ask them they have any Kermit Lynch wines. You can ask if they have any wines from an importer called Legend, which, people may or may not have heard of, but that's how the dial is moved, of people going out and asking for these wines. And I think if someone hasn't revisited Australian wine in a while, there's a lot of incredible diversity. And we're here talking about cognates to Chablis and Moët Saint-Denis, not like Napa Cab, I think I appreciated your direction on that, because I think, that's not any diss on Napa Cab. I just think Australia, we want to make the point that yes, you can get these like beautiful, expressive, ripe red wines, but you can also get laser sharp sparkling wine or Riesling or, really great balanced Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, whatever it is. So, and oftentimes we just have also found that the value proposition is pretty great, that what you can get for the money coming from Australia is pretty exceptional. We don't want Australian wine to be this like sort of token thing of people have like one Australian wine on their list or on their shelves and they're like, oh cool, I like this Pinot Noir, but it's not as good value as my US Pinot Noir, my French Pinot Noir. We want people to say like, holy shit, this Australian Pinot Noir is an incredible value for the price and like really over delivers for what you get. Like it might not have an appellation that people are familiar with on it. Like it might not say Moët Saint-Denis, it might say Gippsland.
Yeah.
And I think that's the leap we have to help people make of like recognizing that there's extreme quality here, even if it doesn't have kind of a fancy name on it that we've been told is fancy and we know is fancy, that it's really about distributors and buyers and consumers being able to taste these wines and be able to taste that there's quality there.
Yeah. I wish we all could taste just like empty barrels without any labels or names or anything and just experience those wines truly blind, So we'd get rid of preconceived notions that way.
Yeah. We've done tastings like that. And there's a Verve, the retailer Verve, they have Chicago.
Well, yeah, started by one of your ex-colleagues, right?
Yeah, Dustin Wilson. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're doing a program with us to promote South Australian wine, and they're doing the tasting of Adelaide.
Cool.
Later this spring in New York, which will basically pit South Australian wines against French wines. So it should be really interesting, and I'm really excited to see what the response is. I'm pretty sure it will be quite favorable toward Australian wine.
That's exciting. Well, there you go. We'll give Verve a plug. Go check it out if you're a consumer and you're like, oh, where do I buy these wines? As I always say, though, have that dialogue with your local retailer or
Absolutely.
Your restaurant professional. But also, if you're a buyer out there buying for a restaurant or a shop, just Google Legends Wine in Australia and ask your distributor partners, how can I find these wines, or talk to Jane and bring them in. Jane, I really appreciate your time and everything that you've given to this wine community of ours. And thank you so much for joining Wine Centric. And I'll tell you all out there, first, go read Vignette, go read How to Drink Australian Wine, and then get yourself some Legends of Australia wine. You will drink deliciously.
Thank you.